What will it take for Americans to consider breaking up? I'm recording this on September 7th of 2020. It's not after because it hasn't been called yet, during the extended United States presidential election. There's still a few states that haven't been declared yet, and there's already lawsuits being filed and other things. And I feel like I'm chuckling here a bit, but it's a very tense time for a lot of people. Myself as well. Right after I was watching it during it and focused on this. And if you're not familiar with my content, I've been focused on politics, specifically American politics, for the last 5 years, in possibly an unhealthy way, in different levels of different things. So with this election, I was tightly following it, kind of just going in the night, just getting some anxiety with this result of this problems coming up and wondering what's going on with these things and trying to hear the things. I've been active on social media, posting these different things and there interacting with people. And I'm thankful for that. And with all these tweets and posts and memes and all these things that I will get to in separate places, there's three conversations in particular from the last couple of days that I would like to highlight, and this is one of them. The reason I'm focusing on these three conversations is I think with the information age coming in, we're now able to actually enter the age of understanding. Because there's a difference between hearing things and listening things and knowing things. Those are kind of three different places. And I think age of understanding is more to actually listen and know something. That's kind of where we get into the age of understanding. And one of the underlying things that I've realized since then is problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So I think back to that video right now that I will link somewhere here, wherever you're hearing this. And I remember saying that I was confident Trump was going to win a second term at that time, unless something major happened. Something major, like a global pandemic, was maybe something that could have fit in that. But even throughout the pandemic, up to the election day, I still was rather confident that the polls were off and that Donald Trump was going to win a second term. Now, I don't know what's going to happen by the time you've listened to this. It might be later on, and it might be Trump, it might be Biden. But regardless, back in that video as well, when I talked about that, is the primary support I had for Trump, and still do, was for his ability to break through this veneer that we had, this glamour that we had about the world that we're living in. Kind of break through that American dream and make people face the American reality. And I think that has been achieved. That, in my opinion, was achieved the day he was declared president of the United States of America. Declared even, I don't know if it was actually the inauguration itself. I forget when I actually said it or when I actually felt it. But I think even just getting the nomination, getting in, most definitely when he was actually president-elect, I think from then on that showed people and that led to a rather fantastic set of changes that I did not really consider possible looking at the socio-political landscape of the way people were in society, the way people were in culture, the apathy people had, the trust in certain institutions that I had little to no trust in, besides trusting that they would bungle things up and just be ineffective, just hoping that, oh, they have so much power, they have so much ability, but they also select for people who don't really have the ability to do this. There's such a bureaucracy involved in it that maybe, just maybe, they won't actually be able to actually be effective enough at bungling things up that you'll be able to squeeze through and continue this human flourishing. So anyway, that's happened. A lot of different things have changed. But just like with the pandemic, when I was talking about that and saying, okay, there's some things I thought were going to be possible that I think I could have done and do if a few things changed, and then that happened, and I was like, oh, man, that kind of now makes me reconfigure these things. And a similar thing with this. The Trump effect, I don't think is going to end. But there's certain things that I had to think of and think, okay, who was going to come after Trump? I didn't really have someone in mind. What was the landscape going to be? But I thought, okay, maybe I'll have 4 more years to think about that and position myself in a better position to achieve the positive things that I think can be put after a Trump presidency or from Trump being on this sphere. So now, even if he's not the president, he will be involved in some certain ways. But the similar thing with me, even if he's not the president, some plans and things that I wanted to do are still going to exist, whether he is or he isn't. The positive things are still on me. It's still on the people. It's not just these institutions. Part of my support of Trump was the fact that people are going to stop relying so much on these institutions and be more aware of these institutions, be more aware of their actual ability, be more socio-politically active. And I think that has happened. That is definitely something we can see from this election. Now, is that positive? Is that negative? I think that comes to how you define what's going on. But what it is actually what it is already. So with these conversations, these are part of how I got away from the anxiety that I had on the first night of the election and second night. Even waking up today, I'm still kind of pondering some things, but it's more of a planning thing like, oh man, I should do this. What should I do this? How should I present this to you out there? And thank you for listening. So among the several tweets and posts and memes that I was posting, I had a couple of different conversations, as I mentioned, that I want to highlight. This one in particular focuses on the Electoral College. And let me read you the comment I wrote with the post, which with the article that I mentioned at the start. The article was "What Will It Take for Americans to Consider Breaking Up" by Jeff Deist. And I do read that article. I'll put it at the end of this presentation, this video, this recording. And this is what I wrote. Read the Constitution on the 3rd. Shall get to the amendments this weekend, but regardless of the eventual president this January, one positive from this could be increased chance of a convention of states. I imagine the abolish the Electoral College rhetoric will be reduced if under a Biden presidency. But I think trust in the system is as low as it has been in the modern era. If some areas despise the Constitution so much, why not secede and draft a more progressive foundation? So this has come up again. It came up after the 2016 election. I looked more into the Electoral College and what it was, and I think there actually is good purpose for this, to have that representation. And then again, here it comes up again. People still seem to not really be aware of it. But I think a lot more people, and this could be self-selecting in my group getting older, they could just be more people that are aware of this information. But I don't know if the youths, or the younger people, the people who are new to politics, really understand what the Electoral College is. People have different opinions and ideas about it, and I've talked to a few different people. And in this conversation, I get into it deeper. As I mentioned, the actual reading of the article will be at the end, or you can actually just go to Mises.org and hear it there, or read it there. They also have a Mises Wire. You can listen to it there. So I've been looking for cogent reasons for why someone would want to abolish the Electoral College. And I posted a different question about this as status, and people did different things. And one friend in particular said, oh, yeah, it's actually good because of secession. It's actually going to raise the chance of people actually want to secede. And this article kind of covers that. It talks about that and says that's probably impractical, but we can probably go forward in ways that can reduce the power and influence of the federal government. Things like just sanctuary cities, just not enforcing certain federal dictates and things like that, or other forms of electoral reform, restructuring, and things like this. But let me get to the conversation now. And as I mentioned, I'll just read the actual conversation and then come back in after with some thoughts. It's a rather long conversation, and maybe you'll be able to see what I saw in here, and I'll build up an idea of how I've gone from being rather anxious, rather on edge, compared to how I normally am right after the election, to having these conversations, watching the things, and just becoming more calm and analytic and like, okay, things are actually going to be fine. At least they can be fine if I do different things, if I define them in a certain way. So what am I going to define as a loss? What am I going to define as the end of the world and things like that? Those are the things that conversations like this have helped me think through and realize a more, I think, positive and productive way forward. Okay, so into the conversation now. I shall refer to the person as TH. So this is their comment. Because secession is illegal, and because the party most disadvantaged by the Electoral College has won 5 out of 6 presidential popular votes since 2000, which suggests it would be more expedient to simply pursue electoral reform on the state and federal levels. And now my response. TH, it would require a convention of the states, and then at least one amendment. On board with you entirely on the electoral reform as well. A more practical thing may be now that more of the populace is politically engaged, they start pushing for an increase in states' rights and the reduction of federal influence. I'm hopeful but somewhat biased, as my life has improved the more politically aware I've become, and I think the general apathy many had is to their own detriment. There's also the precedent set by sanctuary cities, where areas may start to be more selective of what they follow. I think things are already heading to globalization. So even if there is this increase in individual and decentralized government, I don't envision full-on isolation and end of all relations. That's not the pro-human flourishing direction. The Electoral College has its purpose, though. I see people just say, boo on it, but don't provide evidence they understand its intended purpose. And this is TH's response. And I'm doing a bit of an accent. Excuse me, TH, if you're offended by the accent, if you actually do hear this. But I'm just trying to differentiate a bit from what's actually being said. The Electoral College's purpose was convincing slave states to ratify the Constitution in the late 18th century, which is now moot, doubly so since 1965 when the US became a representative democracy with actual universal suffrage. Now it's just an undemocratic impediment to one person, one vote. And this is my response. I disagree with that characterization if you mean it's a primary or central reason. I don't deny there were political practicalities in mind to get the thing signed. But again, if that's to be changed, amend the Constitution. It's as legal to have a popular vote as it is to secede. But if an amendment leads to a system of direct voting, then campaigns and voting patterns shall be different from then on. I imagine about half of the people that don't vote do so because they somewhat accurately think the state will go to their team or against, regardless of their vote. In a direct system, I think they may reconsider. There are age and other limits on voting. You also don't vote across state lines, as in assuming that you are still in residence in Tennessee, you don't vote for the governor of Arizona. The country is still a constitutional republic, a federal presidential one at that, according to Wikipedia. Electoral college is a form of democratically voting for representatives that then select the president. With electoral reform, one thing I would like to see is increase of voting if it's going to be done. With the tech available, do 30-minute or so briefings about upcoming laws, and then ask people to participate in a weekly vote, be it digitally, by mail, or in person. You've got to get at least 15% of registered voters or some other figure to at least prompt the legislators to engage the citizenry outside of traditional campaign season. This is TH's response. Huh? Its only purpose was to give slave states greater electoral power than their minuscule, white, male, and property-owning voting population would give them in direct presidential elections. The Electoral College indirectly allowed those states to claim electors for 3/5 of their enslaved population through the allocation of congressional seats, which was the compromise required for ratification of the Constitution. As for changing the Constitution in the 21st century, 3/4 of the state would have to ratify any amendment. Any amendment that would diminish the role of the Senate or impose direct voting for president would harm the Republican Party, whose two most recent presidents won with the popular vote minorities twice out of their 3 electoral college wins. Since the party is unlikely to ever control less than 25% of the legislatures, I think it controls over half now, no amendments will be ratified in the foreseeable future, and reforms are only possible on the margins in areas like pre-counting absentee ballots or restoring voting rights to ex-felons, ideas that were popular in both parties before 2016. I'm not sure I follow about voting in Arizona elections. If I lived in Arizona, then I would register there. Some places like the European Union allow citizens to vote in their local elections even if they reside outside their home country, but that's not relevant to a country with total freedom of movement, per several Supreme Court decisions. Residency requirements don't make the US or EU member states less democratic, but a system that vastly exaggerates the votes of residents of small areas at the expense of residents of large states does. And now this is my response to them. TH. First, thanks for the conversation. I'm glad to have met people like you and others for some nice, enriching conversation. It's something I constantly am thankful about. But times like this of apoplectic info slinging at each other really highlights this privilege that I don't take for granted. It gives me an added calm with the knowledge that regardless of who gets sworn in come January, however imperfect they may be, all the primary reasons, the people, places, culture, conversations, etc., to come back to the United States of America will still be there. Now back to some highfalutin info slinging. Slavery. I accepted that it was part of why that was done. And even if wrong, and it was the primary reason to give them the ability to continue having slaves by law, they no longer hold slaves. They still are a minority, that is ostensibly a willing member of a collective agreement, a social construct. If I present arguments claiming secession had the legal limits or hurdles to it so the smaller slave-owning states could be confident to stay in, And the more prosperous states couldn't just bail on a whim to their detriment, and certain parts put in or left out to enable politically practical ways to free the slaves. Linked, if you have any interest, I would not mind your take on it. What would that have to do with the current case that the US should just rely on the constitutional process? I've read the Constitution. We'll get to the amendments review tomorrow or later. But regardless, it's the legality. You brought it up for secession. I agreed. And my original post took into account that the Reds and Blues shouldn't just say, to hell with you and leave, but instead, like civilized people, come together and make the case for electoral and other reforms to the laws of the republic they live in. I am proposing that the same be done for those that value direct democracy. Enough people may be engaged for the processes afforded to the nation by the Constitution to amend said Constitution that make it more viable in the next years than have for a while on various issues, a silver lining in definitively cloudy times. Now, should X have full say over what A, B, and C do in Y area with Z resource just because there are more X than A, B, and C combined? I assume you do not support a race with a majority of the population in a given area to have the ability to make the minority races do as they say. But you advocate and support a state with a majority of population in a given area to have the ability to make the other states do so. But that's what the agreement was within the states. LA County, though, does not vote in the other counties' leadership, directly or otherwise. The argument you present even states that the majority put this provision in the Constitution to give a minority some of the say. You are not against minority rights as a concept. This seems to be more about nurture rather than nature case. So I am open to debate and exchange of ideas. I consider direct democracy to be a palatable way of saying mob rule. In a lynch mob, the one dissenting vote is often the one about to get lynched. Me saying Trump won the majority of the counties is like saying this team gained the most yards and had the least penalties. Why doesn't that decide the win? Points are just there to give the team with weaker players the chance to score more than they would in a one-on-one arm wrestling contest. Well, that's not the goal of the game. Just because you are arguing time or possession doesn't make it any more valid. Either of us can engage in the process to change said rules, then compete, and see all parties involved plan and compete in a different way. Then those results we have would be definitive. This current state of California being 4 million plus, while the rest of the nation is plus 1 million to the other candidate, is little more than anything but a stat. If you and others would prefer direct democracy, then have a constitutional convention where you can actually even just secede and have your own direct democracy if the others don't want it. Or you can just act on the hashtag not my president thing and have a hot civil war if you find it egregious enough. If some sort of caring about laws and social contracts is a thing. The mention of Arizona was just an example to continue how there is a practical manner for the nature of laws around votes. What argument do you have for a direct democracy that is valid on a federal level but not across state borders? If one can show that the youth in general is more or less mature and aware today than in 1776, why not just change the voting age to 5 or raise it to 30 due to current year? Why shouldn't it also work internationally? China has more people than the USA. Why don't they have a say? So even if the sole reason for the Electoral College was to get the minority states to have a say, that's part of the argument of abolishing slavery and enfranchising minority groups. That is not part of a direct democracy. I prefer we reduce the power of voting in this sense. It's mainly about redistributing resources and who makes life or death decisions on your behalf than anything, which was some of the reasoning for the net taxpayers and those subject to military draft being able to vote. In conclusion, I do not wish to have a third party impose my will on you or vice versa, as long as you have not initiated force against me. I would appreciate the same in return. However, if I'm on a plantation and have little options outside of suicide to escape it, and the owner says to me and my fellow slaves that we can vote on a slave master that beats us daily or one that does it once a week, and I choose the latter, doesn't mean I'm directly voting for the continuation of slavery, let alone pro the institution. So that's it for the conversation, and now some thoughts on it. Just on the general overall, reading back on what I'm writing here, I have something I'm thinking in my mind, then when you actually read it, when you're actually editing it, it's a different kind of situation. One thing I definitely can improve on is just writing things in a better way. With some people who speak to me on a regular basis, they seem to understand when I don't use certain diction and grammar and things like that. But for other situations, like with TH here, we don't really speak that regularly. Spoke a lot more when we knew each other in college, but not so much recently. But we had this back and forth. One of the first things I noticed was in the initial conversation, when he mentioned electoral reform and the state and federal levels, he was asking a question mark, but in my initial response, I seemed to have misread him and thought that he was supporting that, yet he was clearly questioning that the article itself suggests only electoral reforms and not federal levels. So in my response, it might have changed the way I actually approached this if I thought that was what we were talking about. And that's part of the key here. Problems occur because of how we define X, not what X actually is. So just trying to get this understanding, I noticed that I repeated myself way too much. And I think by not actually having that understanding led to some of the repetitions of me repeating both what I said in the original post and also what was in that article. And another key reason of why I have the article at the end here is also because I hadn't read the article. But some of the things I pointed out in my first response is actually things that were in the article, because I'm familiar with Jeff Deist, I'm familiar with the Mises Institute, I'm familiar with this sort of argumentation. I'm not quite sure if TH was familiar with that content, but they read it, and maybe that's the first time they actually came across this. They've probably thought of it some other times. But they seem to think there is a lack of efficacy in electoral reform on the state and federal levels. But I think a key issue here is their definition of why the Electoral College was actually present, or their understanding of what they're focusing on in this. They're focusing on it was done because these people had slaves and then they did this. I'm focusing more on the mechanism of what was going on, which is why I use the whole, now should X have full say over what A, B, and C do in Y area with Z resources, just because there are more X than there are A, B, and C combined. And I don't think they would agree with my characterization or my understanding or my view of a direct democracy leading to the mob rule in that sense, where in a lynch mob, the person who's objecting is often the one with the rope around their neck. Now, these goes into those what ifs. How much of the population back then was pro-slavery? If it was up to voting to abolish the slaves, would you have majority of the population actually be for it? Or were people more against it for a certain way, and it was more the state reinforcing that? That's a general question. When you come to something like universal suffrage, would that have been something that actually happened? Or does it have a situation where you have the states having their own say over their own local affairs, and you don't have the federal effect there? Then the Wyoming wanted to attract more women to come there and said, oh, let's give women the vote. This is part of it. Again, it's not the primary reason, but that is mentioned as part of the reason why Wyoming enfranchised the women. But then now it comes in a situation where you have, okay, is voting actually a valid way of doing things? What are you actually risking? Who are you taking in for that? And what are you voting about? Why was it when the suffragettes wanted to actually get universal suffrage, it wasn't quite universal? They didn't really want to enfranchise the black man at that time. As he mentioned here, it was white, male, and property-owning people. One thing he didn't add as well is the fact that most of the taxation was due to property. So these people were voting on what's done with money that has been taken away from them. He did not also add that all these men were subject to the draft. So if you voted for people into the government who did policies that would result in you going to war, it wasn't just your money's paying for these wars. Your skin and bones and blood, skin, blood, and bones was on the line according to what you actually voted about. And I think that made people a lot more interested in what was going on. And that is one thing that I think is more of an issue with the current system, that I think if you went to direct democracy, and again, I agree that if you change the current system, if you change the system that people are voted into certain positions, even if you maintain the same power in those positions, even though I'd rather the power in those positions just be ratcheted down, if you had that happen, is there any necessary argument that people wouldn't just try to get that 50%? What is the argument that that would have a better solution versus trying to get over 50% of the Electoral College in the sense that it is now? And the person stating that, oh, the Republicans are always going to control these certain parts of it, so you're never going to get to 3/4 of the country. And I think that is part of the difference. I think part of the difference is we can get to a situation where people are more actively activated. If you have a direct voting system within the states, then those representatives can get to a situation where you convince the people that, hey, unless you actually support getting together in a convention of states and focusing on these things, we will not vote for you to actually be in the position that you're in. So if the claim, let's say, is that we already have a majority of the population who wants a direct democracy, then why is it so hard to convince enough, 3/4, to convince enough of the people who control their representatives in that popular vote sense, into that one vote, one person sense, to get representatives that would support a convention of states? My claim is that right now, with the current activities, this is the best time that there's been a chance to actually achieve that. In this conversation, they did not propose the means in which they think the Electoral College should be abolished. Do they think it should just be thrown out? What other parts of the Constitution do they think are okay to just throw out without following the process in the Constitution? Wouldn't that invalidate other parts that they might consider to be positive? Because this appeal to popularity that, oh, we should just not have it. We should have the popular vote because the popular vote is popular. I don't think that's sufficient enough to do anything. Well, some things. I mean, and maybe there are few things, but this is, again, not understanding where people are coming from on certain situations. Because, for example, I see celebrities saying this and that about this and this other thing, and then people say, well, that's popular, so let's do what that popular person said. Some people seem to think because this person is popular among this certain group of people, then what they have to say about these other topics or what they say is good, but there's different reasons for things to be popular. For example, with this situation, I don't necessarily think they have the same agreement with me on what the government is about, primarily. Just like they said, the Electoral College is primarily about slavery, so we need to stop the Electoral College, even though slavery doesn't exist anymore. Yet these people, I'm focusing on, hey, that's actually the minorities. This protects minority interests. Some of the minority interests might not be positive, but in this system, it encourages an actual conversation, actual discussion, actual understanding before something is changed that has an effect on 350 million people. There's also issues there. Some of the larger, more wealthy states are saying these smaller ones have entirely different interests, and they're affecting our own economies. Why should they have a say over what we do here? If you can make the argument that you say, okay, somebody living in California that has never left California should have an equal say about the people setting laws in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or somewhere else, and the inverse. I don't understand how that applies. It's already enough of a struggle, as you can see in Europe. I mean, there might be other reasons, much older and things like this. But if you say that is a positive thing, because we're living together in this one area, one person, one vote, why don't you push the one person, one vote all the way to the complete individualism situation where no vote I make should be able to give somebody else the power to compel you, a person that I may have never met or have any chance of meeting, to do what is best for me? Why should that be allowed, be it in direct democracy or the Electoral College or the many other systems that exist out there? Make the case for why that is more positive than just complete individualism and not having the state. Now, since we have the state, since we have the Electoral College, make the case of why a direct democratic system would somehow be better for all parties involved. Or you get to the point where that case can't be made. It literally cannot be made. And at that point, there are other things that you can do. I would prefer, like Jeff Dice said, and that I think TH would agree, that it doesn't get to a hot war. I've seen some things, and just as I'm recording this, the Associated Press supposedly has called Pennsylvania for Donald Trump. So despite that happening, there's some people on edge right now. And a little tick up of anxiety right now. Okay, that's new data coming in. I'm going to put this into the old data that I have. What are the projections and things happening? But still, again, if I had just read this and I hadn't gone online to check with some information and then found that notification, would that have changed my anxiety? Would that have changed the plan and intent for me to finish recording this? No. It might have changed it a bit, as in I've added that observation, but I could have chosen to not make the observation as well and have had the observation. So for some of the people already, it's yay, the AP has said it. So now there's a bunch of people who will be celebrating that. For me, I'm aware that there's still court cases and other things, so there's other possibilities. There's going to be some people who are certain that it's a horrible situation. They might have evidence They might think it's something from God and things like that, and they could be very on edge, getting it right on the place. There's other people who have no doubt whatsoever that everything was 100% legit, and they're like, okay, finally the people will accept this, and they're on a whole different spectrum. But the thing that has happened. But the problems will come from how people define what has actually happened. And as you can see with this conversation, as I can see with this conversation, taking the time of recording it, taking the time of viewing it, having the privilege, as I said, to have a conversation with these people, looking back at what I said, what I presented, what we're talking about, the Electoral College is the Electoral College. Back in the past, they created the Constitution for the reasons they created it. Slavery was a thing. Some of the things have changed. Some of the things can change in the future. Will the United States of America, as it is constituted under the Constitution, still exist as a political entity, as a socially constructed entity in 100 years? In 5 years? Some people think it might be over now because they've just recently announced who's going to be president. Some people literally believe that in certain ways. And that doesn't really change the reality of what happened in the past. It doesn't 100% determine the reality of what's going on now. But those definitions do have a large effect on what happens in the future. I, for one, don't think the United States of America is eternal. This is one of my objections when it comes to listening to hard sci-fi books and stories and films, where they go hundreds of years in the future and it's like, oh, there's still the United States of America, still China. I think the way the world is constituted and the nations and the political structures that we live in is in for some change. As I mentioned in one of the responses, I think globalization is coming. In an inverse way, I am an individualist, but I'm also, when it comes to socio-political organizations, I'm more towards a globalist in that sense. I think the more connected we become as a human species, the better it has been for everyone involved. The more we can think this is a fellow human, this is a fellow earthling, the better it is. Now, which are the best systems to do that? That is up for debate. And I hope we actually have these conversations. And from what I know about the Constitution, from the successes that I've seen about the United States of America, I think there are aspects of it that are still worth preserving. Now, I'm going to get to reading the amendments. I said it was going to be the weekend, so I'm going to either get to that later today. I think I have to edit some videos, or sometime tomorrow. But in this next coming week, I will get to the actual amendments and see what the amendments that refer to the Electoral College actually go in. They might actually detail more of why it's done that way it is. There might be a few other methods and things and tweaks that can happen. But with my general projection is, I think the Electoral College will still be something that exists by the next United States election, accepting that there isn't a convention of states and then a whole bunch of things could happen. I don't think it's going to descend into even close to some of these worst case scenarios that people are talking about. So as is, things seem problematic. The Constitution is not perfect. There's a lot worse ways to construct societies than based off of what I know about the Constitution of the United States of America, and I shall know more after I read the amendments. But for now, I'm just going to post the article here. I hope you enjoyed what I was talking about here. If you've already listened to the article before, or went to read it before you actually listen to the rest of this content, then there's just a small review of the content at the end of that. But till next time, here's the article. What will it take for Americans to consider breaking up? This is by Jeff Dice on Mises.org. It's one thing for mass democracy to produce bad results in the form of elected politicians or enacted policies. It's another when the democratic process itself breaks down because nobody trusts the vote or the people who count it. But that's precisely where we are. As things stand at this writing, last night's presidential election remains undecided and looking ugly. At least 6 states are still uncalled, and both the Trump and Biden camps have their legal teams claiming victory. We may be in for days, weeks, or even months of legal skirmishes, all of which can only add to our intense political, or more accurately cultural, breakdown. Today, perhaps 140 million American voters are in purgatory, fearfully wondering what will happen to them if the other guy wins. This is nothing short of a national psychosis, absurd yet deadly real. And it gets worse every 4 years. Despite the narrowing of any policy differences between the two parties over recent decades, if anything, presidential votes are overwhelmingly about tribal affiliations with our kind of person, not substantive ideology. Yes, this is unhealthy. And yes, the psychosis manifests because the stakes are so high. It manifests because government is far too big and rapacious, lawmaking and jurisprudence too centralized in DC, the unitary executive presidency too powerful, and society too politicized. But these are unhelpful truisms. Plenty of Americans abjectly support more government, more centralized political power, an omnipotent president and Supreme Court, and the sharp politicization of every facet of life. In Nation, State, and Economy, Mises talks about a liberal nationalism and explains what a confident nation requires. Quote, a nation that believes in itself and its future, a nation that means to stress the sure feeling that its members are bound to one another, not merely by accident of birth, but also by the common possession of a culture that is valuable above all to each of them. End quote. What then is the common culture Americans possess? What binds us together as a unifying principle? Is it language, religion, constitutionalism, love of country? What country? Markets? It is certainly not obvious, and few of us feel optimistic about America's future. Worse still, COVID lockdowns have attenuated the ostensibly non-political spheres of life, from family and work to sports, dining, movies, and travel. When we stare ourselves in the mirror all day and read everyone's innermost thoughts on social media, we find familiarity breeds contempt. Regardless of how the election turns out, it's obvious that America is not much of a country anymore, much less a nation. The sooner we accept this, the sooner we can get to work asserting the principles of federalism, subsidiarity, nullification, and even secession. None of the current frictions will get better over time, but they can get much worse, and our most important task must be to avoid any movement towards outright civil war. There are workable baby steps towards this. Law professor Frank Buckley writes about secession light in his sober and reasoned book on the subject of a national breakup. Buckley sees a third-way approach between our dysfunction and an outright breakup into new political entities, primarily through aggressive federalism and state nullification. This echoes sentiments from Andre Cordovilla, who similarly argues that the feds simply lack the manpower to enforce federal laws and edicts on recalcitrant states. Just as blue states declared sanctuary cities as havens from Trump's immigration policies, red states could restrict all manner of federal dictates, abortion and gun control come to mind, while simply daring the feds to interfere. At the end of the day, Cordovilla reminds us that there are only a few million of them and millions of us. And progressives, too, share this sentiment. Even if Biden prevails, they remain shaken by the degree of Trump's support. In fact, the 2016 election saw the New Republic advocate nothing short of a renunciation of the hated red states. Things don't have to be this way. Americans are lovely people, generous, open. But politics divides them in the worst and most unnecessary ways. It's time to break up, and millions of us sense this instinctively. So what's stopping us? For one, secession remains bound up with the Civil War and Confederate slavery in the American psyche, distant in time as they are. Manifest Destiny and the westward expansion resulted in a nice round number of 50 states, a nice big American number. Throw in a few specious Supreme Court decisions like Texas versus White, and it's no surprise many Americans still have concrete between their ears on the subject. But Trump may have changed all that. And if you want political liberty to retain a foothold in the US, if you want Misesian liberalism to show a heartbeat in the West, you should cheer this. Americans, by and large, are lovely people, open, generous, friendly, and quick to forgive. A hyper-politicized environment where everything is existential and rooted in race, sex, and sexuality is deeply at odds with our character and well-being. We deserve to live peaceably as neighbors, even if that means breaking up and creating new political entities. Addressing the reality of our dysfunction is not divisive. The divide already exists. Our task is to apprehend this and end the charade of one nation. So that's it. Thank you for listening. As I mentioned, this is what I was going to put at the end. Does reading this change your opinion of the discussion that I had before and my opinions on what was actually said there? Even though with my actual review on opinions after I talk about it, I probably would have referred to this article. I'm trying to keep that to the littlest. I'm doing this in a rather mixed up kind of way where I'm reading this now, I'm recording it before I'm actually recording the reading and my thoughts on the review on the reading. But I probably won't have much to say on that anyway, as is, because I think a lot is said in the conversation. It might be one or two things before leading into this. But thank you. And again, I am reading through the Constitution of the United States of America. I already have the first video up. I shall get to the amendments probably tomorrow, the next couple of days, and post that up. And I will be doing some more things and getting one primary location where you can get this. I think keep in mind for now, carbon33.com. In one way, shape, or form, you will be able to find the things there. Or you can just share, subscribe, and all that wherever you're hearing this. I'm also trying to get figuring out how to get some podcast type of thing up, because some of this content is just rather audio heavy, and some people would prefer to not have to have YouTube or BitChute or something like that up to actually view exactly what's going on, and would prefer just hearing it, as I sometimes do. Okay, so that's it. I don't know when you're listening to this, but as I'm recording, we still haven't heard the things, whoever's president at the time. I think the United States of America is still there, and I do agree with what Jeff Deist is saying here. From my experience, Americans by and large are lovely people, open, generous, friendly, and quick to forgive. And this is in large part due to them being human beings. Team human, we're all here, and there's certain things, that structures about the country that I think enable that and empower them to do that in some of the best ways that humanity can do. And so till next time, goodbye.